Everybody, good evening. I'm Kate Seeley, Senior Vice President of the Middle East Institute, and I want to welcome you all to tonight's very, very special event featuring Egyptian-Lebanese multimedia artist Lara Baladi, who will be discussing her recent works, followed by a moderated discussion with Sackler curator Carol Ho, who will be talking further about Lara's work and its impact. It's very rare to host here in Washington an artist from the region with the kind of scope and depth and impact that Laura's work has had. Her body of work encompasses photography, video, installations, collages, montages, sculptures, tapestries, and even perfumes, I gather. I'd like to see that one, or smell it. And she employs these many techniques as a means of expressing her deep personal experiences, which are interwoven with her questioning of the social conditions and circumstances in the world in which she lives. In her latest project, which she's working on as a fellow at MIT's Open Documentary Lab, she's researching and applying new technologies to what she calls her transmedia project, Vox Populi, archiving a revolution in the digital age. It's an interactive storytelling project based on her efforts to archive and interpret the 2011 Egyptian revolution. For Lara, like so many artists in Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East, the protests of 2011 unleashed what she has called a Niagara Falls of production, of art production on all different levels. Among the artistic energies that Lara employed or released or channeled during that time included co-founding the Tahrir cinema and the first free online radio, Tahrir Radio. Now she's working on her digital archive of the Tahrir Revolution. Her work, and I'm not biased, is wonderful in so many ways. It is conceptual and yet visual. It is personal and confessional and yet universal. And above all, it's just really, really good. And it has been recognized and embraced both in the Middle East and internationally. She was awarded the Grand Nile Prize at the Cairo Biennial in 2008. She's exhibited at the Venice Biennale in 2011. Her work is collected in private and public collections, and she showed in openings in Europe and elsewhere. It's also very exciting for us here in DC that the Sackler Museum will be exhibiting an artwork of hers for 9 months, starting in August. So more Washington audiences will get a chance to see her work. And we're very grateful to the Smithsonian for giving us this opportunity, and that's thanks in part to our moderator tonight, Carol Ha, who's the first curator of contemporary art at the Sackler and who has a keen appreciation for Middle Eastern art. She is responsible for building the gallery's collections of contemporary Asian art, especially in the area of photography. One of her recent projects included organizing the museum's first series of video art from Asia. So thank you both so much for being here with us tonight. It's really an honor and a privilege. But before we begin, just a little bit about MEI's Arts and Culture program. It's a new program. We established it 10 months ago under the wonderful guidance of Lynn Snej, who's been doing art programming in the Middle East for many years, and who comes with an incredible network of artists and deep insight into the region's art scene. And we see the promotion of art and culture as very much part of MEI's long-standing mission to promote American understanding of the Middle East. And we also established it in recognition of this incredibly dynamic art scene emerging from the region at a time when Arab artists are finding their voice, and their voices are telling new histories and talking about new narratives. And we want to introduce Washington audiences to these key civil society actors who we see as very positive change agents. So we're trying to make this program sustainable. We're doing monthly art talks, panels, film screenings, but we'd like to do so much more. We want to do art exhibits, photography installations, musical performances, but we need a much larger space to do so. So one of the things we're currently working on is expanding our, what do we call this, our auditorium. We can now seat 47. We're going to be tearing down these walls and expanding it to seat 120. Eventually, we hope to buy the building next door and take the carriage house and turn it into an art gallery for contemporary Arab art. So we have big ambitions, but of course, we need your support. We need your help, your suggestions, your contributions. So please come talk to me afterwards if any of this is of interest to you. And in the meantime, let's get on with the show. Lara, please, the podium is yours.
I have a little second of silence after this amazing introduction. Thank you very much, Kate, for this very beautiful intro. And it's really nice that nobody asked for my biography, and to have you just bring it together in that way is really. I'm very touched. And thank you, Lynn, for, where are you? Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to see you again after 11 years. And Carol, thank you for being next to me. So when I have a little moment, I can tap on your seat. And I want to thank everybody in the room for being here. I've met a few of you briefly before. I hope to have an ongoing conversation afterwards. And thank you so much for the ones here that I know and that I love and that came to see me. So I hope I won't disappoint you after this extraordinary intro. So I'll explain a little bit. I'll go through, I have half an hour to go through this, so I'll run through it. I'll talk about the project I'm doing at the moment at MIT, Vox Populi, Archiving a Revolution in the Digital Age, and try not to talk too much about it and to have it more in conversation with Carol afterwards. So I'll look at a little bit like the larger context in which I'm working and where I'm coming from. This is an image that was published in 2006 following a protest in Cairo, in Tahrir, and it was against the war in Lebanon. And it was the first time I went down to the streets. And as you can see, in the good old days, we had 600 policemen to about 100 protesters. It was quite an extraordinary experience because not anybody really in that demonstration was really there for Lebanon. It was a very messy kind of event where people were standing and claiming different demands for different causes. And it was really extraordinary for me as an experience of demonstrating in Cairo. It was, there was a mix of the Kifaya party, which was one of the main opposing party at the time against the Mubarak regime. There was a kid without shoes holding a picture of Nasser. There was people in white with Lebanese flags. I mean, it was this very strange kind of mix of demands that were not really focused. And at the time, I was doing a digital collage that was about the law of the jungle and this notion of paradise, but also paradise being kind of conquered by whoever is the strongest to get it. So I made a little section of the collage. I made a kind of parody of that protest that I was part of. So you can see Condoleezza Rice in the left at the bottom, and a lot of very different kind of types of demands or people demonstrating. And it was surrounded by Russian dolls on which was basically each doll was one of the dictators in the Middle East. So you had a kind of guard around this parody. The larger piece looks like this. It was called Justice for the Mother. And it really is a kind of interwoven stories of the notion of paradise and loss of paradise and this representation of paradise in sort of popular imagery. And so I used the poster from Chinese posters representing waterfalls and put my father at the front of the picture, leaving the Middle East, leaving 30, 40 years of his paradise, and sort of actually going towards something he thinks is going to be probably a better world. But in fact, on his jacket, which you probably can't really see here, is the Twin Towers falling, which was taken from an imprint on a T-shirt that I found in Senegal in 2002. So it was this very strange kind of, repetition of history, and one leaving his own history to find it, to have to confront it again. So when the revolution started and Mubarak was toppled, I think one of my first shock was that the cliché of the pyramids as the emblem of Egypt was actually replaced by the cliché of the bird's eye view of Tahrir and the hundreds of people that were filling the square most days during the 18 days and afterwards. Of course, this moment in history we all know was unprecedented. It instantly turned the page on the Orientalist view of Egypt, the thousands of years of the monopoly of those images of the pyramids representing Egypt. And for me, it was quite a shock because in a way I had started my career as an artist more than as a photographer when I moved from photography documentary to making more sort of fictional types of works, into having used photography at when I moved back to Cairo. One of the big works that I had done was the one you see here, which is called Dunya, the mother of the world, which is also a reference to what we call Egypt. And it was really a kind of turning the Orientalist picture of the desert and Leonard and Landrock type of photography on their heads, and therefore picnicking in the desert, like in the good old days. The picnic actually got me to exhibit at the Fondation Cartier and be commissioned to do this work because the curator, when I met him and I showed him pictures of my friends in the desert, he said, "I don't understand, you picnic in the desert? For Westerners, the desert is a place of adventure and death, and it's not somewhere you're supposed to enjoy." So I was fascinated not only by, of course I was fascinated with the politics of Tahrir, but there was so many layers to what was happening. And one of them was a very strong sense that the way history would get written was being challenged also in the way it was happening and by the way it was happening. So this image, I think, reveals a lot because of the number of cameras that people are holding, and for every person, a camera, for every camera, thousands of images for thousands of images, most of them downloaded on the internet. And so it really, for me, felt like a new era in the medium was starting, in image making, and really was this kind of shift that was happening while, of course, the politics of, unfolding on the ground. One of the first YouTube videos that went viral on Jan 25 was titled Tiananmen Like Courage, and it was one of the first videos I actually saw before going to the street. It was one that made me go to the streets, but its resonance with the title in itself, Tiananmen Courage Like, already says it all. So it was not only the powerful video and the extraordinary moment that we felt we were experiencing, but also this immediate kind of resonance with past events in the world and past historical events in different times, different places, but that sort of repeat. There's a sort of archetypal pattern that suddenly appears. And that really triggered my need for archiving the uprising and its aftermath and kind of keeping a trace of what I was experiencing and what was going really fast too. So it was a way of dealing with it also. Images such as the Egypt Influence Network, which was representing how people were tweeting out of the square and how, who was really influential on social media, was part of the overwhelming experience and the sort of inspirational materials that were coming out of Tahrir. So this kind of visual data visualization and ways of using information was really also part of my, the sort of avenues that I started to look at and to study while I was collecting material. So from the 18 days in the square, archiving was present from the first day. Archiving, for me at least, was, I think, revolting itself. It was at the center of the Sanaya, at the center of the roundabout of the square. You can see bloggers and rubbish bins. The whole organized kind of the way the Tahrir was organized. And you already had, remember, we didn't have internet for few days, and yet people in the center of the square were able to connect to certain people who could access to internet and could send out and disseminate the archives that were being thrown into the Saura tent, the revolution tent that was in the middle of the Sanaya. So you had people taking photos and then uploading their footage in the tent, and ongoing kind of creating an archive as they were revolting. With this archive that I collected for myself at first, which was really a very personal kind of initiative, was the first project that I did with it was a few months later, after the revolution started in July 2011. We went back to the square. There was another sit-in, and I had just given a talk in New York and realized that many people in the room were from the Middle East, yet they hadn't seen any of the stuff that I was showing them. So I realized this is crazy. I mean, this is actually something we all think everybody's seen. So there's got to be something wrong going on, because this is called the Facebook revolution. So where is the gap between, what is actually really being, disseminated and what is not? And so, of course, from that conclusion, I also knew that most people in Egypt, unlike what we thought, don't have access to internet, and still rely on media, the state media. So the first project that kind of came out of the building this archive was Tahrir Cinema, and Tahrir Cinema was really born overnight in a very kind of spontaneous move, and was a real kind of ongoing series of projections that were set up every day, every night, and for 3, 4, sometimes more hours during the night, were sharing with the protesters in the square the footage that we had, and testimonies, and different activists coming to talk about what they could do and how they could help, or the work they were doing, such as no to military trials, for example. And so there was this real debate that kind of, it became a kind of platform for debating the revolution, a platform to share and disseminate footage, to actually build the archive of, in part of Mosirin, which was also the people who, the media platform, activist platform that I co-founded the Tahrir Cinema with. And all night, people, after seeing the footage, would come and give us their footage, and we would give them the footage that we had shown. Amateurs, professionals. I mean, it was quite a very buzzing kind of experience. And following Tahrir Cinema, which was dismantled by the army at the end of the July 2011, just before Ramadan, a few months later, I just thought, okay, I have to make sense of all the things I've collected. I have got to find a way into all this material that I've put together: videos, photos, articles, tweets. I mean, even, it gets kind of crazy. So you start photographing your screen. And so there's like all these layers of, archiving the archive, and it's kind of crazy. So I found a way into trying to make sense of a little bit of what had happened so far, and created this 3-channel video installation called Alone Together in Media Res. It's 42 minutes, but I'll show you just a couple of minutes just to give you a sense of what kind of archive I've collected, and how I created a sort of narrative, or what I call a commentary on Tahrir. So just to one detail, the archive I've made was chronological in terms of the events happening in Egypt, but also some of it in parallel to what was happening in Egypt, what was happening outside of Egypt, and the language that was used on Facebook and social media. So even things that people posted as commentary, as references of what they were experiencing, but were not necessarily footage from the revolution. So they could be excerpts from films, or conversations, or songs, or all kinds of material. I will stop here because I don't have much time left. But you can see this on the internet if you Google Lara Baladi Creative Time Reports, and you'll find it. So I jump back in time, 2002, where I've started looking at archetypes and patterns and repetitions in history. It was the time of the Intifada in Palestine, and I'm not I'm not comfortable in terms of talking about politics directly, but I thought there was something about this sort of repetitive cycle of war and peace that had to be kind of addressed. And so here I'm sorry, Lynn, but I'll skip the video because otherwise I won't be able to make it to the end. But basically, this piece was my first installation, and it's a sort of lantern that glitters. The lights turn on and off, and it sort of depicts this eternal cycle of life and death, war and peace, and it's a metaphor of the evolution of man, except here it uses a pregnant fake Barbie doll. And so she sort of grows up and gives birth, and then the baby grows up, gives birth, and so on. I don't think I have time to show the video because we're kind of running out of time already. So I'm sorry about that. With Roba Vecchia, which means in Italian ragman, and there was a presence of the Italian community in Egypt, so there are still some words that have still made it into today as vocabulary. And Roba Vecchia was an installation I did with a computer program that was sort of semi-randomly selecting images and articulating them into this prism of mirrors according to a color scheme. So here I'm looking at the Walters Benjamin's reference and way of talking about optical tools as metaphors to how history is written, and how the kaleidoscope as a tool or as an optical tool is made of leftovers, of bits and pieces of glass and dust and so on, and where history is written with whatever's left of history, the leftovers of history. And so here I was just coming back from Japan and having this crazy digital overdose, and I felt, what am I going to do with all that stuff? I've photographed so many hours of video and so many images, and first time I had a mobile phone, and it was completely, overwhelming. So I thought a lot about, okay, we have this, how do you tell narratives from all this, and how also you use your digital trash. So this notion of leftovers of history and this digital trash sort of came together into making this life-size kaleidoscope, where each of us have an individual experience of the world, yet we experience it in very different, we experience situations in very different ways. And so here is a metaphor also for how we're given the same sort of possibilities, but we live them in very different ways. This is a visitor walking inside the kaleidoscope. So as they're walking, those images are moving. So there's also a sense of, ongoing kind of pattern changing again and again. And I'm showing this project because it sort of sets the tone earlier in my work to what I'm trying to do now. Because first, because it uses computers and programming and this sort of like randomness of how you can use digital material, but also it's a way of applying technologies to storytelling and to look at the possibilities of multiple storytelling. So then how do you tell the story of the revolution and what is left of it? And I use the word revolution consciously, just for those who might want to ask me about that. But this is, so the way I'm working with Vox Populi Archiving a Revolution is I've divided the project into two parts. One is a part where there is there's been since the beginning, since the square and since the Saura media tent in the center of the 18 days in the square, and until today, there's been initiatives to archive the revolution and different aspects of the revolution. So there's so many websites, organizations, universities. I mean, there's all kinds of initiatives to keep trace of that period and its aftermath, and I'll just show some of them as examples. And then here, that's an interesting one because this one also starts looking at the possibilities of not only archiving, but actually using the archive as a platform for narratives and for telling the story of the millions of people that were in the square. and this is a recent one as an example, is an archive of the vocabulary and testimonies based on the vocabulary of the revolution. And of course, importantly, Mosirin, which is a platform that has actively and in an activist way contributed and documented and resisted during the revolution and until today. And today, they've just months ago closed the office, so physically they don't really have a space anymore. So now the question of where does this archive go and what do you do with it and how do you protect it and where do you find that new free space? So it's a virtual space, it's a physical space, but it's a necessity, and it's one of the big questions that surfaces. So at MIT and with students at Harvard, I've staged an event last semester to kind of initiate a conversation around how do we actually archive history in the digital age? How do we make sense of these thousands and thousands and thousands of visual and text production that come out of events like Tahrir? How do you keep a trace of this digital production in the face of Google search engine and the algorithm of Google, which more and more and more, especially in the last couple of years, has focused on keeping the present rather than keeping the past? And how do you bypass that way of searching that will only limit you to the sort of thing that Google thinks you want to see? So these are questions that a lot of people are asking in the field, and I'm trying to see how we could create a federated research system, which means that to create a way of linking all these archives, so they all remain independent from each other, but there's a way that they are actually open to each other. And so you create one portal in which you sort of dig into the bottom pit of the internet as an archive itself and go directly to this archive to retrieve the possible information that you're looking for. So you sort of save time, but you also save the actual ephemerality of internet as an archive. You save the archives, in fact. So this is let's say the social mission behind Vox Populi. And here are just examples of how data is being just presented as a sort of rough draft of the project that I'm intending to do. The second part of the project, of course, becomes, archiving sounds very, there's something redundant about archives and a little bit boring and not very dynamic. And so the other part of archiving is how do you then keep this archive alive, and how do you keep the spirit of Tahrir alive? How do you keep the possibility how do you also sort of figure out and use data visualization and all these new methods to use, to analyze big data to try and visualize the patterns that we go through in history, the pattern of a revolution in this case, and attempt to understand them so that we don't repeat the same mistakes, which of course humanity has been doing forever. So the second part of the project is a little bit more of a free space, and also the part I call the narrative space. So it's inspired by the electric board metro map from Paris Metro, which was, I think, from the 80s or 90s. I don't even know how old it is, but somehow, you could, on the keyboard that you see, you could press the name of a station, and out of all the data, all the map of Paris, you would see where to go and how to get there. And so this kind of extracting information from a large amount of information becomes a kind of way of also seeing history from a very different angle, visualizing history. Here is a color. It's a page from. It's interesting because it's Exodus, so it's from Egypt, but it's a page from the Bible that was entirely color coded by John Wood in 1880. So I thought that was I've kept this in my drawers since 2001 because I thought it was fascinating. And so this idea of sort of highlighting different parts of history by, instead of going into the verticality of internet and looking day by day and on your same screen the information, to actually have it completely spread out horizontally, and even more than that, maybe in a 360 degrees kind of way. Here there's an example of a timeline, and a very visual timeline. So I took a little the section that deals with Egypt. And cartographies of time. This is another example of the Chelsea Girls, and also I like the organic kind of connections that reminds me also of the metro here, and using visuals in sort of highlighting moments in a timeline. Until, of course, the Wikipedia and this whole notion of keeping traces of information. The work is called, I call it a transmedia painting because I see it as a painting, as a kind of interactive painting where the painting is not static anymore, but it's influenced by this wall in Mohammed Mahmoud, which is really a timeline of the revolution, and where all the artists from the revolution have again and again and again drawn layers and layers of moments and martyrs and portraits and all kinds of interpretation of the revolution. And the idea is, how do we bring in this aspect of the revolution, the street, with the virtual world and what has been produced in the digital space. Timelines are also represented in a circular way, as time is eternal, so the symbol is a circle. And so here I'm showing a little bit where I'm heading by thinking, the sort of contemporary 21st century kind of panorama idea, where you're actually put into a space and almost feeling like you're in that space and that space actually exists. So you recreate the experience itself. And my friend Max is here reminded me that we have one of the ones that exists still in the world, which is the war panorama in Cairo. So that's quite extraordinary. This is one of the scenes you see. And then people, looking as if this is real. And so hopefully this interactive panorama of the revolution will be a way of for people to participate. And it's funny because this guy has a phone in the photograph. So my sense is that with what we can do today is to really involve people in the storytelling of the revolution, and sort of be actually active in that storytelling, rather than be obliged to see their own story told by the regime in the next education books. And thank you very much. And I know I took 4 minutes 44 too much, but thank you very much. Will I come back to you?
Where to begin? It's fascinating to me. Maybe we could just step back and talk about the relationship of some of the works to your project. Every step is sort of an evolution. And in the case of the Sackler, for instance, we'll be showing El Dunya, and hopefully having some presence for the Vox Populi project. So can you perhaps reiterate, I know you sort of glossed over that, but can you go over again the relationship between something that is a different kind of imagery, and certainly a kind of imagery that's well known in the history of photography, and then how that relates now to your new project of relating to image making in particular, and how that is a part of your work. Sorry.
May I interrupt one
I'm sorry.
Could you move closer together?
Oh, sure. We don't fit in the video.
There's an overflow room, and they can't see you. And we don't want our overflow people to miss everything. Thank you. Sorry.
Are we good like this? Oh,
Yeah. That'd be very intimate. Okay. I think that should be better. Sorry.
Nope, go ahead. So to look, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to answer your question correctly, but what I didn't say here, there's a lot of little parts that I did mention, but since 17 or 18 years, I've been part of the Arab Image Foundation, which is based in Lebanon. I started my work as an artist with photography. And as I started and moved back to Cairo, I also became part of that foundation, which was a very interesting turn in time, a choice to go back to the Arab world rather than stay where I had grown up in Europe, and also look at photography as a medium that was really in transition at that point, at a very important turn of history of photography, where digital, the sort of digital world was beginning, and people were speculating a lot on what could come out of this and how photography would survive. And of course, there was a moment. Hello. There was a moment where it was a moment where it was a few years after the war in Lebanon ended, and a lot of people that had lived, that had been diaspora of the war and had lived outside, came back to the Middle East, and there was a real desire and a sort of a moment that climaxed that brought a lot of energy back to these big cities in the Arab world, and it was the beginning of a movement of thinking our own voice, and I think the Arab Image Foundation was born from that. So it was a kind of a way of turning Orientalism on its head and trying to see if there was an actual Arab voice in photography, in image making.
So really reclaiming photography.
Yes, or at least
The
finding
rich
out.
histories of photography. Right. So I'm going to jump forward a little bit just to keep us within our time period. So it is. Okay. Throughout the sort of moments in your work that you've shown, you've embarked upon either research or the gathering of materials and realizing the artwork. What's interesting now with all of the Vox Populi project is that it's become this two-part. You've split it apart in a sense. There is the federated research part that is very much builds on the Tahrir cinema and public engagement. And then there is the more controlled environment of creating the work. Can you talk about how you work with those two arms of your project?
So, I mean, it's a very overwhelming project. It's kind of, it's pretty, I think, ambitious to even think I can do this. But it's almost for the work to actually happen, I've had to think about how to break down the project to actually be able to move forward and to get something, to make something happen and work. So ultimately and hopefully, almost these two projects should be kind of connected, except that the technology and the timing of working with a large community. I'm also alone. I'm not a foundation doing this. So there's it's a lot of steps in for each aspect of the project and the parts within these two main parts to actually schedule and kind of lay ahead. So I've had to do this almost to be able to even work a way through. So I'm hoping that at one point these two will become connected somehow. But I'm seeing that these will be work that sort of parts of the work that have to be done in parallel, and that have to be thought through almost together, but also separately. So the narrative, the part of the narrative, ideally, if this federated research could already be taking place and that it was already established technically, then it would be extraordinary and fascinating to be able to kind of invite an audience into filling an architectural frame that sort of visualizes the timeline of the revolution, but with the interactivity aspect, which is that the user would be part of the storytelling, and to be able to sort of re-experience something, or at least spread that frequency that we experienced in Tahrir, because I don't think it's over, and I don't think that frequency actually dies. It only dies if we make it die. So hopefully this will be kind of put together again at a later stage.
When you talk about you mentioned just now that what is happening in Tahrir is not, there's more to come. There's, even just thinking about past history from 1946 to 52, I mean, Tahrir Square or Midan al-Ismaili and then later Tahrir has been a really loaded site spatially. in terms of kind of reflecting what's happening politically and socially in Egypt. So there's more to come in that regard. There's also another part, though, of the project where you see the archiving of the revolution, a revolution, as something more universal. Yes?
Yes, because I think when you start opening these huge boxes and these huge questions and this, this whole field, you suddenly have all these questions that are raised, and every step raises another 10 issues that you need to, or problems that you need to solve or think about. So some of the archives that exist are today, they constitute a political tool. Some of these archives constitute an actual language of the revolution, a popular language that was born in the revolution. Some of these archives are already public and they're not really threatening anybody. So they're just threatened to disappear. I mean, there's very different issues that start to kind of surface when you approach such a big project and such an exciting kind of way of thinking. How do we write history with all this material, and also how do we sort of like take outside of Tahrir this idea? Because first of all, Tahrir doesn't belong only to Egypt. I think the whole point of this project is that we're forced to look at history in very new ways. The role of social media was extraordinarily important, and it cannot be ignored in how actually history is written. So it becomes also about the archetypal question of archiving history. It's not anymore about that event, but maybe if it's done properly and if it's done with the right people, with the right collaborators, with the right approach, then it can actually be used as a structure, as a framework for many events to come and many events that have happened. So it's really about thinking the kind of guidelines of the situation at large that we're in.
Certainly. We've certainly gone through a phase, especially really with artists leading the charge, of questioning the ontological status of the archive, right? Who owns it, the authenticity of the documents, what the sources are. Archiving from below, archiving from above. What's interesting here is really to think about, because you have these sort of two parts, there's the federated research where there is a need, an acknowledgement, and a need for making all kinds of material available from all of these different corners. And then there is the subjective part of it, the part where you as an artist are handling archival materials in a certain way, right? It's that kind of consciousness that I find interesting.
Well, it's when you're in a sort of dual situation, you look for the way of bringing it all into this one unity space. But there's always that kind of, my natural tendency is to go and do something crazy with the archive. And I think I will. Part of it will be that. So one of the difficulties I'm facing at the moment is how to, what can I give back? And how can I step out of being an artist that does like these kind of sort of works that become the work of an artist, but how can I actually give back to my community? Because if I don't do this, I feel personally that I wouldn't have learned anything from what happened in Tahrir. That what we learned in Tahrir is that we actually have 30 years ahead of us of a lot of work to make the society change at a very root level. So it's not. So if I don't participate in that, then it's as if I didn't do anything. But at the same time, I do work with images, I do work with archetypes, I do work with tales, narratives. I mean, that's how I work. So my tendency is, of course, I do have this incredible image in my head that I need to manifest. So this timeline of the timeline, the drawn timeline that I showed you, I think is a beautiful image, but I'm imagining something like this that would be also interactive, and that it's a a kind of orchestration of data, where tweets and videos and text and comments that people leave on YouTube videos and so on become a language of, a kind of conversation that is constantly shifting and moving. And I would like this to kind of mirror our own memory and how our memory works. And our memory is not static. So what I remember of Tahrir today is not at all what I remembered of Tahrir 2 years ago. It's not at all the way I will talk about Tahrir in 2 years. So I think that also that non-static aspect of how we remember and understand history is also what I'm interested in trying to actually work out in this work and in this long-term transmedia painting.
In wrapping my head around transmedia painting, it's very interesting from an institutional standpoint, because it's very much still, the dusty archives, the materials that archaeologists have brought back, certain kinds of imagery and squeezes and drawings and all that kind of stuff, where academics or scholars come and shape it and then produce something informative. What's fascinating here is that you are, correct me if I'm describing this poorly, but you're creating a certain kind of structure for the general public, for individuals to then create stories, to engage in the narrative. So for the timeline, for instance, you've created a structure, and the palimpsest of history and of multiple ways of looking at history, you're enabling the public to tell. Is that where you're going towards?
Yes, I think. I'm actually in a program at MIT that deals with interactive storytelling and applying new technologies to storytelling. So it's really all of the conversations that I'm part of at the moment, and where there's this new. There is another transition in media, which is that documentary is really shifting towards a very new form of documentary that kind of cross over between games, video games, and traditional documentary forms, and your relationship to internet. So then you could check one of them, for example, is called Prison Valley, which is by David Dufresne, and it's a documentary about prisons in America and how they're used for the economics functioning of America. But you can almost play it like a video game. So you can sort of ask it to show you a testimony, or you can move on to the next scene. So there's this whole relationship with making the story yourself. So that's a sort of tendency that now is very much, it's accelerating. That's sort of language. And I'm sort of, ideally, I haven't done it yet. So, it's like kind of weird to talk about something you haven't done. But ideally, like the big image I have in my head is that ideally what this work should do is, first of all, keep a kind of, a very utopian moment that, yes, was maybe naive, but it was real. And moments of it were real, and they were extraordinarily intense. And I think it's like almost like when you have a moment of consciousness and you lose it immediately after. But because you've experienced it, at one point you can tap back into it. So I think if we don't keep at least that from Tahrir, I think we've really lost. Yeah. So I think it's everybody's role and what do you call it? Responsibility. Yeah. To work and to do that, and also to not forget that Tahrir was kind of like maybe, and poor Tunis, every time I say this I feel really bad, but because of the scale of Tahrir, there's something about what happened in Egypt that sort of became the epicenter of what we remember and what we've experienced of, the Occupy movements and so on. So, some of it is directly connected, some is not, but there was a moment that didn't belong only to Egypt. And so this timeline, if it's well done, and if it's if the framework is well done, then you can maybe start seeing how, history repeats itself, not because of cultural geographies, but because of our own human condition, and how we can actually start seeing these links and these connections between places in a much more productive way for the future.
in a sort of emotional way too. I mean, it's very visual.
In
it's
every
also
way.
emotional. I think you're also working
Every
with
way.
sound.
We want to
yes?
embrace everything.
I mean, you as the person who is the artist, archivist, historian of today.
I'm not a
in
historian.
a sense.
No,
But you're attentive to every part of it. It's not just the image now. It is sound.
It's the frequency.
Frequency.
I think that, if you stay on an intellectual level, then you
Yeah.
stay and you miss something. If you
Right.
stay on the emotional level, you miss something else. So it's this balance between having the information and the capacity of tapping into the information, but maybe hearing the information from your guts rather than from your brain.
Right.
So your brain can tap into it too, but I think this relationship is very. I like doing that in my work a lot. Is to sort of bring people into a space and feel things, but if they want to intellectually unpack the work, they can too.
Right.
So it's this, and living in Egypt has taught me that a lot, because most people don't know how to read and write or know anything about art per se. So what do I care about giving them a kind of very conceptual, closed kind of language that they won't even be able to even see as a language or even approach. So for me, it's always been very important to sort of find this balance and try and open the space for everyone,
Right.
As much as possible.
So, in opening this space for everyone, of course, we all know and appreciate how much artists tend to be very much at the forefront of really mucking about with technology, encountering it, pushing its boundaries. So just a little bit about what it's been like for you to be dropped into the center of technology, really, in the making. I mean, you embrace and you have to learn really quickly a lot of things in order to realize in order to articulate your forms and your ideas. What has that experience been like?
That's a little bit why I put the donkey at the beginning. I don't know if you remember the picture of the donkey, but it's like, Jesus Christ, I'm not a machine. I mean, I don't really like technology. It's not because I like technology that I went to MIT, but I think it's a bit incontournable. Like you can't avoid it.
Yeah.
And my guts have always been very accurate somehow. I mean, I've got that capacity of like kind of having this sense that something is there and I have to go. And somehow I feel that what I've learned in throughout the revolution is, first, my relationship to internet changed completely. I'm not of an internet generation. I'm much older, but I had to bypass a lot of my kind of limitations with internet and really like, okay, now I've got to get this because otherwise it's not going to work out. So I learned a lot, and I also felt, wow, this is fascinating, and my God, there's so much more I should know. So it got me excited, and I also know that what I'm trying to do is only possible because of the nature of the language I'm going to, or the alphabet I'm going to work with, which is the production of material, the mass production of material that came out of the revolution, and the era we live in. So, the thousands and millions of tweets and the thousands of videos and the zeros, the lots of zeros in everything you start opening something and you just, there's no end to it. So it's another type of alphabet, and it's another language, and so it's about if you're going to use a language, you need to understand the structure of the language and the support system. So that's why I felt I've got to put myself in that context. And if I'm not going to be completely lost in 5 years, I better know what the hell is about to happen in the future, because I think I'm curious. I'm very curious about it. It's very exciting what I'm learning, and you never think you know anything, because there's always like hundreds of people that know so much in those fields. So it's like being a beginner all the time. But it's great, and I think it's also very difficult to constantly kind of remind myself. And watching people around me, it's like you have to remind yourself that technology is not a means in itself. It's just a vehicle. And so there's a bit of abuse of technology, and I don't particularly like it. So there's always also this like, okay, let's not be gimmicky, and let's use technology as a really almost transparent. It should not even, you shouldn't feel it.
Right.
I mean, if it's successful, then you shouldn't feel it. You shouldn't feel the technology. The technology should be there because there's no other way of manifesting this idea. And in this case, in this project, that's the way
Right.
to manifest it. So it's not iron, it's not leather, it's not
Right.
photography, it's actually technology and internet and so on.
in itself. So I'll just switch gears for the last question before we open it up. So opportunities to actually interact with your vision, right? You had the transmedia painting, sort of the start of the transmedia painting event. Was it last fall?
Notes from El Sanaya, yes.
Yeah. And then upcoming in May, we'll be at the Berkman Center at Harvard, another iteration of the project. So it's still evolving.
Yes.
We'll have a work on view at the Sackler and maybe some presence of Vox Populi and maybe the third iteration. How are you organizing this? How should we imagine what will
ask my
happen at
friend
Harvard and what will happen next?
My friend here, who is not looking at me at the moment, always tells me how he thinks I'm crazy because I'm so organized. But yeah, so it's. I mean, one of the very overwhelming aspect of this project is the size of it, the scale of it, and in whatever direction you look, the scale is huge. So I mean, at one point I've had to, and I'm still sort of processing a lot of things. It's not like I know exactly where this is going, but I think there's a point in any process of creating or making anything, whether it's an art piece or anything else, it's, there's a point where you have to kind of unpack your idea, and things don't happen unless you do them. So I decided, okay, I don't know how to use all this technology, and clearly I'm not going to figure it all out in one day, and maybe never, but at least what I can do is start working by using bits and pieces that I feel could be kind of like demonstrations or articulations of narratives using a part of the archive. And so what I've been doing and what I've shown you, not all of it, but I had, for example, Alone Together, the 3-channel video installation has stemmed from making the archive that I've gathered. So I think the way to manage this and also to keep my sanity is to constantly create small projects that are steps towards the bigger picture. And so actually to have this kind of profusion of possibilities as you walk forward, you also kind of leave a flower here and here and there, and kind of this is really good, it works, and it could actually even work on its own, but in the meantime it also helps you conceive the next step,
helps you organize bits of it.
Yes, and and prepare towards the bigger picture, so towards the actual collage of technologies that will allow for this reading, this general reading, rather than this little data visualization or this independent piece, or but I think that's for me the way. I'm finding this is making me able to kind of anchor kind of objectives in time, so I can get somewhere at some point. Hopefully some of it will be ready for the Smithsonian.
Yes.
August.
Have to come to the pavilion. We'll have some sort of performance of something.
Yeah, you'll have some like bits and pieces of virtual reality and augmented reality and God knows what. But
rewrite the story of Tahrir.
But I mean, what's fun about being at MIT is that, suddenly I'm exposed to all this, like being in a laboratory of technology, which is literally what it is. And so, we get presentations, and you can attend presentations every day of all kinds of people and things, and there's so many things being invented. I mean, not all of it is interesting, I think, but sometimes I get excited by one thing, and a lot of the mindset of today is to put all these programs freely
embrace.
And open source online. So it's really accessible to everybody, except you have to know it's there, of course. But once you know it's there, it's like, okay, it's there, let's use it. And you can actually start telling one little story with one little code that somebody has taken the time to write, and could be a great little poem for, a moment in the timeline of the revolution, or even just out of any kind of context. So there's these great little possibilities, which I think are, we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time and write another dramatic program and rethink Google every time you do a project, So I'm having fun too.
Right.
You're just crazed, but you're having fun.
Yeah, there's a lot of snow, but I'm having fun. I have to thank I don't know if he's still here, but one of my flatmates came to my talk, and he's been complaining about the snow, but I'm really happy he came, so I want to thank him.
So with that, why don't we open it up to other questions? Yes?
Thank you so much. So interesting. I have one quick question, then a longer one. And forgive me if you said this already, but I would love to know more how one goes to see your work. Is it your website? Is it Vox Populi? How do you see? You mentioned one thing, or are there a gazillion things? In which case, too bad. I'll follow up with Kate. But that's one question. And also I would love to know what's happened to Moserine. I'm so sad to hear that Moserine's physical space has shut down, and I would love to know what is that because they've been forced to. What does that signify? And in the larger context, I'd love to hear how you think of the importance of your work and what you're doing, or the value of. I think it has great importance and value, but I don't want to embarrass you. But how you think about the role it's playing as events evolve in Egypt. So in today, when you couldn't go to Tahrir and show the cinema, for example, what's the role of, does this archive now become an active voice of protest, or how do you see the role of what you're doing evolving in the context of the catastrophic political evolution at the moment in Egypt? Oh, I'm Cynthia Schneider. I teach culture and diplomacy at Georgetown and work with Brookings and work with a lot of projects involving artists from the Middle East.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Nice to meet you. It's been very nice to also look at you while I was talking. It's always nice to kind of. Okay, question number one. My memory is not very good. So, how do you find my work? Well, everybody complains because I don't have a website. So, of course, I'm at MIT, so I don't have a website. So, so there's. I have a gallery, and it's called Grimaldi Gavin. So if you Google Lara Baladi Grimaldi Gavin, you'll have a whole list of works that I've done. So that's one way in. And then I'm happy to send you some links also if you want afterwards. The second question, which is I think more important, is yes, the situation with Moserine, for example. So no, it's not because they've been forced to shut down. Actually, I'm actually quite surprised that they haven't been under more pressure than they are. But it's more because of funding. And they do have a very kind of a strict policy about where to get funding from and how to move forward. So they've been very selective, but also the situation in Egypt has been very difficult for a lot of the NGOs and independent cultural spaces, activities, and so on, and many more, because of this law that came out in November, which sort of puts pressure on foreign funding. So on top of that, you have not just Moserine, but you actually have, it's a real crisis. So you have an actual a series of places that were extraordinarily meaningful and that have done a lot of work that now are forced to end their contribution. So Moserine is not closing because of that, but the fact that they have to close the office, of course, raises the question of where do you protect the archive? Where do you put a copy of the archive? And then again, this question of, do you send the archive to America? And so we start again with Nefertiti in Nefertiti's bust in Germany in a museum that has, left the country and where it comes from. And again, the kind of loss of culture to the West. So then you have again all these questions that are being asked, and of course the question of freedom and space. And I think, I had a conversation with Khalid Abdallah, the founder of Moserine, before I came back in January, and I told him about the project, and it was great because it's exactly what we're all doing. And somehow the wave on which the wave that we've been riding, all of us, some in spite of ourselves and some in a determined kind of way, is still kind of holding us in the same spaces. So you see people, I mean, what people are doing today is archiving. So it's been an ongoing process, but the real focus today is on archiving and on creating that space. So what I'm really hoping to do, and I've networked already with the community of people who have archived, is to really think this idea of, seriously studying where the archives could be saved, how, and then of course how these can be used to allow for this memory to not die, because otherwise it's as if we haven't done anything. So I'm not sure it answers your question. And what's your third question? You asked the third question.
I don't want to take all the time, but how the meaning of your work has changed as the political situation has changed.
I mean, it just feels even more necessary to do something and to give back to the community. I think the big disappointment with Tahrir, before the political disappointment, is actually the social disappointment. It's the realization after 18 days that no, the world's not going to change overnight. Okay, Mubarak was toppled, but that doesn't mean that the people will have more food or they will be suddenly able to read. So how do you actually sort these problems that deserve time and attention, not just a kind of whatever magic baguette. So a lot of people, I think, are engaging in doing this work, which is the hard work, actually. So it's important to do, and everybody takes the task that they can. So I'm trying to do the task that I can. I mean, am I right? I don't know, but I also feel I don't want to remain in that kind of bubble of the art world, and feel that at least as an artist also, I'm also able to continue to ride that wave that we started in the square.
And in a very practical sense, though,
Sorry.
I'm just going to say, your little part also is developing a website for the Vox Populi project. Can I say that?
Yes, you can say that. Yes. So yes, there will be I'm developing a platform that really explains the genesis of the project and really, and as a first step towards the federated research, at least shares the research I've done on localizing archives of the revolution. So it will be a kind of entry into a list of where you can actually find information on every possible aspect that has been archived so far. So already, it's a step towards, the bigger project.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much. I'm not very familiar with the Middle East, but I'm very interested in your work, and I appreciate what you have presented to us as an individual artist. I think it's very important to have an archive. If we look back to China, which apparently lacked in building up archives of the Tiananmen, whatever we call it, massacre, or that is certainly a lack in history. So it's important to build up such an archive. My question goes maybe a little bit astray from what you presented. It goes back to this mentioning of history and universalism that was quite present in the beginning. Mm-hmm. I wonder, as I say, I'm naive in that aspect. For me, that revolution failed. And I wonder what is the universal pattern that you take out of this utopian idea of making a revolution, which in the end failed. So where is this history now being present? You put the history, which was real, into the digital culture, which is something which is very necessary. But on the other hand, where is the universalism? Do you compare patterns? You talk about patterns. Do you compare patterns with other failed revolutions? Or do you compare it with successful revolutions? So I don't see quite the pattern issue being clear to me.
I don't know many revolutions that were successful, but I don't know. I'm not a historian, again. So I'm more interested in seeing if orchestrating the data and looking at anchors in the timeline and looking at what in parallel happened in the world, and sort of, it was really interesting when I did the event at Harvard last December, because it was on a Wednesday or Thursday evening, and the next Saturday, so 2 days later, was there was already a call for a Millions March in New York and across America, and it was called the Day of Anger, and there was a Facebook page called the Day of Anger, and that's what the 28th of January, Day of Anger, Day of Rage was called. So there's this kind of like also appropriation of similarities or appropriation of history that are brought back into the future and into our present. So I'm not looking at this from a historian point of view. I'm just hoping that by being able to articulate this timeline in a certain way, that actually, if there are any patterns, if there is something that we're not seeing because of this verticality of the world we live in, the internet and the screen, if there is a way to actually retrieve, go out of that verticality and look at the world and that evolution of information in a way that shows us something we may not be able to see so far. Hopefully that would be the success of the work. Now I think there are resonances across time and across spaces. It cannot be a project about the world. I mean, I'm not going to live 100 years, so this is going to take a lot of time. But it could be a project about sort of attempting to understand a moment, a kind of crescendo moment in history. Whether it's a war or a revolution, doesn't need to be a revolution necessarily, but how do we look at it today? And is there a way to look at these moments, given that more and more of these are going to happen, and that we are dealing with social media and all these tools that we have and the way we are. So how to make best use of these new approaches to understanding data and reading big data, and I think it's a very interesting time because there are many kind of pockets of data visualization types of projects, and it exists. It's not something I'm inventing. I'm not inventing anything, but I think what doesn't exist is the possibility of using that as an alphabet rather than an end in itself, and seeing how all this material together can be a multitude of narratives. So I'm actually embracing subjectivity. I really don't believe that I'm going to write history or find, the magic formula for making the world another world tomorrow. But I think we can start there and at least keep a trace, while keeping that trace, hopefully understanding where it went wrong. And by understanding where it went wrong, remembering that we failed and not repeating that failure.
I think there's something also interesting to be said about the nature of the archive that you're building. In other words, you mentioned Google previously, and the way generally for the public, when you use a search engine and the information that comes up is actually quite controlled and tailored in a way based on an invisible history, right? What is fascinating then, for instance, with your timeline project, is that the information isn't forced into a hierarchy that we're not seeing, right? So in thinking of cycles or loops, for somebody to look at the timeline and see the text, the cries from 1946 and Evacuation Day, independence and freedom, and then to move down the timeline before or later to 2011 and hearing the language or seeing the language. That visualizing of the timeline seems to be a very interesting way of perhaps identifying some of those loops, some of those repetitions.
And maybe finding connections between aspects of the revolution, of what happened, and start unpacking also what happened. So maybe you could search it like we searched the metro map in Paris and kind of start seeing if there are any correlations between, if you speak to technologists, they tell you, anyway, everything is correlated. So you can correlate anything. And there's these funny sites where you have these really ridiculous kinds of information that, yes, there is a correlation, but then there are also interesting correlations that can be made. And so by visualizing the information or color coding it, you can maybe start seeing a rhythm in how things have actually happened, and maybe start understanding if, at which point the army was doing what it was doing, because it was doing it from the beginning, but it wasn't just the focus necessarily of how the situation was being looked at, or at which point sexual harassment and violence on women after the 18 days, at which point did it start, and how did it, and when did it start? Was there is there a rhythm in how these things happen, and the parallel with these similar kind of mediatized event outside of Egypt that were happening? I mean, there was a real focus on violence on women in the world for like a couple of years following Tahrir. So I mean, I think there's interesting. I mean, it's fascinating material. So I don't know where I'm going. I'm just doing it.
Last question.
Last two questions.
Hi, my name is Amin, and I have a question about collecting this. I feel that there is a scope of the sources where this information is coming from, because it's digital, is quite vast. Everybody has a camera phone and everybody is documenting that history. So now that you're collecting and creating this archive, has there been a challenge of authenticity, of where it's coming from? Because the reason why I ask this is because I know that some time back I saw a local news story from Pakistan after the Peshawar attack, and some of the images were actually images taken from Sandy Lake Elementary event, and it was, so clearly there was an issue. There was a major journalistic issue there, and I wonder if all the documents or all the digital pieces that you're collecting from all over the place, is there a challenge of authenticating where the information is coming from, and how is it being addressed?
I think. Thank you. It's a great question. I mean, I'm being asked that question a lot. Copyrights, and is it real? What's where is the truth in all of that, and where is it coming from? Who's producing this material? How is it produced? I mean, is it photoshopped and so on? So, I've created, first of all, the archive I've done over more or less 3.5 years, and I've really started that because I felt that was the only way I could make sense of the number of questions that were in my head, every day, every second, every minute. So I wasn't attempting to archive the revolution for some kind of general entity that would, that I would give the truth to by having this archive. So that's not where I'm coming from. But then when I brought my head out of the water and out of the internet, especially, and looked around, and also as I'm archiving, I start archiving spaces where people are archiving. So I bring my head up and I think, okay, well, what I'm doing is only a tiny, 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 tiny part of something that needs to be done, maybe, maybe not. And so many other people are addressing the issue of archiving the revolution from their own point of view. So this is where this idea of federated research becomes interesting to me, because yes, it's great. All these people have done great, great work, and I feel really humble in terms of looking at how everyone has worked so amazingly during those years. But I feel, okay, now how, if you kind of take a drone and just fly above and look at, the bigger picture, how we don't have museums. We're not going to have a museum for the revolution. This is all digital stuff. And anyway, there's not going to be a museum in Cairo built for the revolution. We know that. So, where do you go from there? And is there a way to then create this kind of virtual museum? So I'm not interested in my own archive in that way. I'm interested in it as part of as a comma in a much bigger sentence. And I'm also, again, embracing subjectivity. I think the whole point of linking this archive is because there are so many narratives and there are so many points of views. And there wasn't a leader in Tahrir. I mean, that was part of the failure too, maybe, maybe not. But there was definitely as many stories as there were people that came through the square. So
It's also interesting to think generally your use of open source. I mean, there's also that sort of ethos around open source and a kind of creating a community because it's so public is self-regulating in some ways, right? We hope. Right? So
Which is
that
the future of internet, the decentralizing idea of, we hope, well, it is. So yes, I mean, this idea of creating peer-to-peer conversation.
Hi, my name is Sharon Bovat. I'm voice of a moderate, and I'm now your biggest fan. I'm actually a blogger. I was controversial blogging. I was complaining about corruption and fraud in Tennessee, and I was actually jailed 3 times. But because of the ACLU and the American Constitution, I was vindicated 19 months later. It was a hassle. And then I was told not to travel to 4 states because 4 states in America can swear out warrants, and they can try people, and they tried to make blogging illegal in Tennessee. But thanks to the ACLU, they stopped it. And I look at the blogger situation now in Egypt, and I've tried to be an artist, but I'm not. And I've tried quirky videos, and now tonight I'm going to go home and try some of the techniques that I've seen in your ways. Now, you're an artist, not just not an activist, but with archives. And this is an important part of history, and like you said about bringing it to America. Is there any role that the United Nations could play? Or to express your work. I mean, because it really is art, but it's art geared towards the millennials that have a shorter attention span, because you have like the different dynamics. And I was just curious, where else can you take your work?
To Carol. Well, my flatmate left, but he should have answered that question. He mentioned a place, I mean, okay, when you start talking about this, then you're talking about surveillance and privacy and security and protection and so on. And so like I said earlier, some of these archives that exist are produced by NGOs or by entities that now hold this material as almost as a political tool and also as a very fragile tool. So those questions are really important because there are stories of, what do you call it, like sort of agreements between countries also, which I'm not able to answer. I'm going to have to talk to lawyers about that. But there are systems of which allow one country to ask and have complete power over sort of confiscating archives or information from another government, and there's agreements with certain countries that don't allow that. So this problem, and I'm really sorry for my ignorance, but it's a story I was told, and it was testimonies from Ireland from I think 20 years ago that were kind of put in a time capsule. But because of this agreement and because the lawyers and the people that had worked on that archive were not aware of these legal agreements between governments, they were forced to give the archive to the government, to Ireland. And yet they had managed to ask these people to testify about the violence that they inflicted during those the conflicts, and to talk about what they had done and why they had been violent. So in the end, it puts them in danger. And I'm not sure what happens next, but it's this kind of situation on one level that is very, again, like it's like a whole other world that you have to address. But then there's the more what would be the word for it? The more kind of what would be the word for the more like, and it's not ethical, but this idea of, the cultural relationships between countries. And so do we allow again for our culture to kind of fluidly kind of vanish into somebody else's drawers? And do we repeat history again in that sense? So this empowers the country where you put the archive, where you leave the archive. And so these questions are like, I mean, there's 1,000 questions. It's like you enter Alice in Wonderland again and again and again and again, that whole again. So I don't know if I answer your question, but yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you.